Welcome to Chimney Sweep University's online training series. If this is a free version, questions, interactive images, and certifications will be turned off. If this is a paid version, questions, images, and certifications will be available. Go to chimneysweeps.com to sign up for the paid version series. Enjoy your training presentation on ladder and scaffolding safety.
Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be, well, it might seem pretty basic at first glance, but we're going to be talking about ladder safety.
Oh, yeah.
And you might be thinking, okay, well, you know what's so complicated about ladders, right? You climb up them and you climb down them.
Right.
But really, we're talking about ladders in the context of OSHA and in the context of chimney sweeping.
Right.
And really, when your workplace can be, 30, 40 feet up in the air on top of a roof, suddenly those stakes get a lot higher.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be talking about OSHA standard 1910.23, which is all about ladders and how it applies specifically to the sorts of challenges that you face as chimney sweeps.
For sure.
And just to kind of give you a little teaser here, I think you might be surprised by some of the things that we're going to be talking about.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because even if you think, ladder safety, OSHA might have a thing or two to teach you.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways is that a lot of people feel that they know ladder safety because it's something that they do every single day or they see every single day and they're like, oh, I got this.
Right.
But these regulations are in place because incidents and accidents have happened.
Right.
And they're meant to protect workers and employers.
Right.
So we're going to go through those, and I think that you're going to be surprised by some of the things that are in here that maybe you don't do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So let's jump right into it with probably the most basic aspect of ladder safety, and that is inspecting your ladder.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about OSHA section 1910.23B9 now, which says that every single day, every work day that you were using a ladder, you were required to visually inspect that ladder for any defects.
Absolutely.
And we're talking cracks, we're talking loose rungs, we're talking anything that could compromise that ladder's structural integrity.
Yeah. So many times we go to jobs and we're looking at their equipment and the feet are missing or the feet are cracked.
Oh, yeah.
Or the rails are bent or the rungs are loose.
Yeah.
Or they're using a fiberglass ladder that's been painted over and over and over again. And you can't tell if it's damaged underneath that paint.
Right.
So it's really important that you do that pre-check every single day before you use that ladder because it could save your life.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple, right?
Yeah.
You look at the ladder, you think, okay, well, it worked yesterday.
Right.
Why wouldn't it work today? But
Right.
you're literally trusting your life to this equipment.
You are?
Those few minutes that you spend just looking it over,
Yeah.
from top to bottom could be the difference between, having a safe day at work
Yeah.
and, ending up in the hospital.
Right. Or not going home at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you do find a problem with your ladder, this is where I think OSHA gets really specific and says, okay, well, here's what you have to do.
Yes.
1910.23B10 says, if you find a problem, that ladder needs to be tagged.
Yes.
It needs to be tagged with a very specific tag that says, dangerous, do not use.
Yeah. Or removed from service.
And removed from service, right? Yeah.
Just sometimes guys will be like, oh, well, I'll fix that later.
Right.
No, it needs to be removed from service.
Right.
Until it's fixed, if it's fixable.
Right. And so this isn't just about following the rules. This is about making sure that everybody on the job site understands that a damaged ladder is a huge risk.
Absolutely.
It's not something that you can just sort of brush aside,
No, and it protects you as the business owner.
Right.
Because if one of your employees goes to use a damaged ladder that hasn't been tagged and they get hurt,
Oh, yeah.
that's on you.
Right. Yeah. You're liable.
You're liable.
So, absolutely make sure that that ladder is tagged. If it's damaged, take it out of use and don't use it until it's been repaired.
Absolutely.
All right. So let's say you've got a ladder. You've inspected. It's good to go.
Yeah.
You're ready to start climbing. Are we all climbing ladders safely?
I think that there's some really specific ways that OSHA says that we should be using ladders.
We've got 1910.23B11 and B12. These both talk about facing the ladder and maintaining 3 points of contact at all times.
At all times, yes.
So think about it like you're a tripod.
Yeah.
2 feet on the rungs.
Yes.
And one hand or two hands on the ladder at all times.
Yes. 3 points of contact always.
They're always stable and secure.
Yeah, and this is another one of those ones that we see people doing wrong all the time.
Yeah.
You know, guys are reaching way out to the side or they're twisting around to get something
Yeah.
and they're letting go of the ladder with both hands.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, well, you're just asking to fall.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that myself, overreaching or twisting around trying to get something.
Absolutely.
But especially for, chimney sweeps who are often working in really tight spaces.
Right.
Up on a roof.
Yeah.
Maybe you got a dormer or something like that you're trying to get around. And it's awkward and you're trying to reach for something. It's so important to remember those 3 points of contact.
Absolutely, because all it takes is, that one little slip and you could be falling.
Right.
And at that height, it could be fatal.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so it's not just about how you climb, it's also about what you're carrying with you when you're climbing.
Yes.
1910.23b, 13. This one is all about avoiding carrying anything that could throw off your balance.
Yeah.
Now, this is especially important for chimney sweeps because you guys are often carrying, brushes and rods.
Yes, all sorts of heavy equipment.
Yeah, big, heavy equipment up and down ladders. And so, imagine you're up on a steep roof.
Right.
You've got your ladder. You're trying to carry, a heavy brush up that ladder.
Yeah, and you only have one hand on the ladder because you're carrying the brush with the other one.
Right, and you're really asking for trouble at that point.
Oh, absolutely.
So what does OSHA say that we should be doing instead?
So OSHA wants you to prioritize balance. So they recommend using things like tool belts,
Okay.
pulley systems, or having a helper to assist you with carrying that equipment.
Right, so basically just thinking ahead of time
Mm-hmm.
and planning out, okay, well, how am I going to get this heavy equipment up this ladder safely?
Yes.
Rather
yeah.
than just trying to muscle it up there with one hand.
Right, because the last thing you want to do is be halfway up the ladder and lose your balance and fall backwards.
Right, exactly. All right, so we've been talking about ladders in general, but let's get a little bit more specific and talk about portable metal ladders.
Okay.
1910.23c, A01, says that these ladders need to have slip-resistant surfaces.
Yeah.
So we're talking about those grooves or ridges in the rungs, or maybe they've got a special coating on there.
Or skid-resistant coating. Yeah.
That's designed to give you a little bit more grip.
Yeah.
This might seem like a small detail, but when you're working on a rooftop,
Right.
maybe it's wet, maybe it's icy
So
out.
slippery conditions.
Yeah, those slippery conditions, that little bit of extra grip could be the difference between, staying safe on the ladder and taking a really nasty tumble.
Absolutely. And, especially in our industry, we're often working in, not ideal conditions.
Right.
It might be raining, might be snowing,
Yeah.
it might be icy.
Yeah, the roof might be slippery.
The roof could be slippery.
Yeah, so having that extra grip is really, really important.
Absolutely.
And, it's easy to overlook those small details, but OSHA is basically saying, hey, we want to make sure that you have every advantage possible when it comes to staying safe on a ladder.
Absolutely.
So speaking of staying safe on a ladder,
Yeah.
let's talk about ladder capacity for a minute. 1910.23c3 basically says don't overload the ladder.
Right.
And that seems really simple, right?
It does, but you would be surprised how many people do
Yeah.
overload their ladders.
Yeah.
They'll buy a ladder that's rated for 250 pounds, and then they'll get on it with all their tools and their equipment, and they weigh 275 pounds. And it's like, well, you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah. And it's so easy to do because, you get caught up in the job and you're thinking, okay, I've got to get this done. I need to get up there. I need to bring all this stuff with me. And you just sort of forget to do that quick mental calculation.
Right.
In your head. Okay, wait a minute. How much do I weigh? How much does all this stuff weigh?
Right. Am I over the limit?
Right. Am I over the limit for this ladder? And,
Yeah.
it's not worth the risk.
It's not. It's not.
Because if that ladder breaks while you're up there,
Yeah, you're going to have a bad day.
yeah, you're going to have a really bad day.
Yeah.
So, all right, last thing I want to touch on before we move on is ladder placement.
Okay.
1910.23c4
Right.
really emphasizes that you need to be using ladders on stable level surfaces.
Absolutely.
And if you can't find a perfectly level spot,
Mhm.
you've got to take some steps to secure that ladder and make sure that it's not going to slip or tip.
And you think about it, especially when you're on a roof.
Right,
Roofs aren't perfectly level.
right.
There's pitch to them. There's angles.
Yeah, there might be debris up there. There might be, moss growing on the roof.
Absolutely.
It could be wet. It could be slippery. Yeah.
And you've got a chimney right there in the middle of it.
Right.
So you're not going to be able to put your ladder in a good spot a lot of times.
Right. You're not going to have that perfect flat surface to work with. So you've got to be really careful about making sure that that ladder is secure.
Yeah, and a lot of times that means using a ladder stabilizer.
Okay.
Or tying it off to something secure,
Right.
because if that ladder slips out from under you while you're up on a roof, that's a long way to fall.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that could be fatal.
Yeah, so I mean, you think about all these things, right? You're working on a roof.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the most predictable environment.
No.
And OSHA's really saying, hey, we want you to be thinking about how to make that as safe as possible by making sure that that ladder is secure.
Absolutely. And, the most important thing is to just take that extra time to make sure that everything is set up properly.
Right.
Because it's better to spend a few extra minutes making sure that your ladder is safe than to spend weeks or months in the hospital recovering from a fall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
1910.23b8, this kind of jumps right into it.
Yeah.
Ladders are only for climbing up and down.
Right.
And, that seems kind of obvious, but
You would think.
it's tempting, right?
It is.
Like to use it for other things.
It's, you'd be surprised how often you see that, I'll just use it for this one quick thing, and that's when a lot of accidents happen.
Especially, in a job as specialized as chimney sweeping.
Yeah. You got heights, you got tight spaces, you got specialized tools. It'd be so easy to say, oh, I'll just reach over on the ladder instead of taking the time to reposition it.
Right.
But, just picture this. You're reaching for that tricky spot leaning out, and suddenly the ladder shifts. It's not meant for that kind of movement.
Right.
Especially in a chimney sweep situation where you've got uneven ground, you're carrying heavy equipment. The risk is tenfold.
Yeah. No more ladder gymnastics.
No more ladder gymnastics.
Wait, so what about 1910.23c6? This talks about shifting or moving a ladder while you are on it.
Oh, yeah, that's a big no-no.
Huge violation.
Major safety violation, yeah. And for good reason.
Yeah, imagine trying to, adjust your footing and the ladder starts to slide.
Oh, especially halfway up a chimney or something.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Basic physics, your weight distribution on a ladder that changes its stability.
Totally.
And chimney access points aren't always on level ground.
No, they are not.
So, yeah, big no-no.
So the bottom line is just stay put until you are safely on the ground.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's move on to placement.
Okay.
1910.23c, 10 and 11. Talk about angles and extension. So I'm just picturing like a chimney sweep setting up their ladder.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just leaning it up against the chimney.
Right, right.
You've got to keep in mind the 1 to 4 angle rule.
Okay.
So for every 4 feet up, the base needs to be 1 foot out.
Okay.
Creates a nice solid base. And then you also have to have it extend at least 3 feet above the landing surface.
I see. So getting up under the roof or...
Yeah, exactly. Think about those gutters that you often have to clear to get to a chimney.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
You don't just want to reach it, you want to reach it safely.
It's not just about reaching, it's about reaching safely.
Exactly.
Okay, so this next one's straight out of a movie montage gone wrong.
Yeah.
1910.23c12 strictly forbids tying ladders together to make a taller ladder.
Oh, that's a huge no-no. Yeah, ladders are not designed to be joined together. That creates weak points in the ladder and under pressure,
I mean, we've all seen it, yeah.
I've seen cases where they buckle under the weight of a worker, sending them plummeting,
Wow. Yeah, no DIY ladder extension?
No DIY.
All right, and speaking of things we've all seen done wrong, let's talk about 1910.23c8. This addresses the pop cap of a step ladder.
Right.
Is it a step?
It is not a step.
I've seen people use it as a step.
I know, but it's designed for stability. It's not a step.
Right.
If you stand on it, you're so much more likely to tip over.
Yeah, and I'm thinking especially about, you guys working in those tight spaces.
Oh, yeah, carrying tools, you're leaning to maneuver,
Yeah.
That top cap is not meant for that.
So no standing on the top cap, no matter how tempting it may be.
Absolutely.
All right, so, we've talked about some pretty crucial general guidelines, but step ladders are kind of a staple for chimney sweeps, right?
Oh, they're essential
Yeah.
for navigating all those tighter spaces inside homes.
Right.
Yeah. Got to know how to use them properly.
So let's deep dive into some of those specifics for step ladders.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
So first off, you have the metal spreader, or the locking device, 1910.23c2.
Yeah.
This is not a suggestion. This is essential. This keeps the front and back sections of the step ladder securely open.
Right.
Without it engaged, the ladder could collapse, especially when you're working at a height.
Yeah.
Inside a chimney, not a scenario you want to experience.
Definitely not.
Okay, so then you have step spacing, 1910.23b3.
Okay.
Proper spacing between 8 and 12 inches.
Okay.
So that ensures you have secure footing as you climb and prevents you from overreaching.
Especially when you are inside a chimney, right?
Oh, yeah, and you're carrying all your tools and everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, proper step spacing is key.
Okay, got it.
And then we have the minimum step width.
All right.
That's 1910.23b4,
Okay.
at least 10.5 inches wide.
Okay, so that's like for your boot to fit on there comfortably.
You want to make sure you have a stable platform to stand on.
And especially when you're working in, those tight spaces up on a ladder.
Absolutely.
You need a little extra room.
Yeah, you need all the stability you can get. Okay, so we got the spreader spacing step width.
Yeah.
What else is there? Oh, weight capacity. Yeah, 1910.23c3 covers that.
Oh, right.
Step ladders, just like any other ladder, they have a maximum load limit.
Right. You can't overload them.
Yeah, especially not in a chimney.
Right.
You need to factor in your weight, but also the weight of any tools and equipment.
So like if it's a 250-pound ladder and I weigh 175, I got like 75 pounds for all my gear.
Exactly. Simple math, but it's crucial for staying safe.
Right. Absolutely.
And of course, we can't forget about the top cap.
Right. Even though we already talked about it.
We talked about it before, but it's worth repeating.
Especially with step ladders.
Yeah, especially with those, because they're so often used for those quick everyday tasks.
Yeah.
It's meant to be a handhold, never a standing platform.
Okay.
No matter how tempting it is, standing on that top cap increases your risk of falling.
Got it. We just spent a good chunk of time exploring ladder safety, all those PIPs and regulations. Well, hold on to your hard hats, because now we're going even higher. We're tackling scaffolding.
Stepping it up, literally.
Exactly. And, you sent me this whole pile of OSHA regulations on scaffolding. I got to say, I had no idea it was so complex.
Oh, yeah. It's way more than just like stacking a few boards on some poles, right?
There's so much more to it. So to kick things off, can you give us the big picture? Like, what are the main OSHA regulations we're looking at, and what's the main goal here?
Well, we're going deep into OSHA 1926 Subpart L, specifically the sections that deal with scaffold safety. And really the big goal is pretty straightforward. Prevent falls and keep workers safe at those heights.
Makes sense. So let's say I'm actually building a scaffold. What are some of the most important things I need to keep in mind according to OSHA?
First things first, OSHA wants to make sure those scaffolds are built strong, like really strong.
Okay, how strong are we talking?
Well, 1926.451 says scaffolds need to handle 4 times the maximum intended load. And they have to do that without failing.
4 times the load.
Yeah.
Wow. So no cutting corners on materials or how it's put together?
Yeah, no cutting corners. You got to use the right materials, the right connections, the right bracing techniques. It all matters. And the taller the scaffold gets, well, the more crucial all those details become.
Right, because the higher you go, the bigger the potential fall.
Exactly. That's why OSHA says that for scaffolds over a certain height, you got to have them designed by a qualified professional engineer.
Oh, so it's like meeting an architect for a skyscraper.
Pretty much. You wouldn't build a skyscraper without an architect, would you? Same idea here.
Yeah.
These engineers, they calculate wind loads, stability factors, all these complex forces that can impact the scaffold structure.
So you got to trust the experts on this stuff.
Absolutely. For a pole scaffold, anything over 60 feet needs that professional design, according to 1926.452A10.
60 feet, got it. What about other types of scaffolds?
Well, if you're talking tube and coupler scaffolds or fabricated frame scaffolds, anything over 125 feet needs a pro's stamp of approval. That's 1926.452B and 1926.452C for those keeping score at home.
Okay, so we've got our professionally designed scaffold, built with strong materials, solid connections. What's next?
Now we got to think about the platform itself, the actual work surface where people will be standing. And 1926.451B1 is super clear about this. Those platforms got to be fully planked.
Fully clanked, meaning no gaps.
Exactly. No gaps, no missing boards. It seems basic, right?
Right.
But, when you're in a hurry, it can be tempting to just leave a tiny gap.
I can see that.
But even a small gap, that could be all it takes for someone's foot to slip through. And that could lead to a nasty fall.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about those little details until something goes wrong.
And those details can have big consequences. And that attention to detail, it extends to how wide those platforms need to be. 1926.451B2 says they generally need to be at least 18 inches wide.
18 inches. Wow, wider than I imagined.
Might seem like a lot, but think about it. You got workers moving around, carrying tools, materials. They need space to move safely without feeling cramped or losing their balance.
Makes sense, but I'm guessing there are some exceptions to that 18-inch rule.
Right, you're right. Some scaffolds, like those smaller portable ladder jack scaffolds, only need a 12-inch platform width. That's according to the same regulation, and there's a reason for that.
I'm guessing it's because those ladder jack scaffolds are used in tight spaces where a full 18-inch platform just wouldn't work.
Exactly. It's all about adapting those safety standards to the specific job site, right?
So We've covered planking and platform width. Now, what about keeping those platforms stable? I can't imagine it's very safe or comfortable to work on a wobbly platform.
You got that right. Platform stability, that's crucial. And 1926.451b3 addresses this. It specifies how far a platform can extend from its supports. Generally, it can't be more than 14 inches from the work surface.
Okay, so the platform needs to be fairly close to what the workers are actually working on. Makes sense.
Mm.
Are there any exceptions to that rule, though?
There's one interesting exception I came across. For plastering and lathing work, OSHA allows for an 18-inch extension. That's 1926.451b3.
Wait, 18 inches? That seems like it could be kind of dangerous, especially if you're dealing with wet plaster.
Yeah, at first glance, it does seem a bit counterintuitive, but there's a reason behind it. Plastering and lathing often involve reaching out with long tools. You got to spread materials over a larger area. So OSHA probably figured out those tasks just need a bit more freedom of movement.
That makes sense. A trade-off between stability and the needs of the job.
Exactly. But you can bet OSHA's still going to be really strict about how those extended platforms are supported and braced to make sure they're safe.
So they're not just throwing safety out the window, it's a calculated exception.
Right. They're all about those details. They want to make sure those platforms can actually handle the load. So far, we've got a solid foundation, sturdy platforms, and regulations that take into account stability and the needs of different jobs. It seems OSHA's thought of just about everything.
They've definitely done their homework. It's clear they're serious about preventing accidents and keeping workers safe. But I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface of scaffold safety, right?
Oh, yeah. Just getting started. There's a whole world of different scaffolding designs out there, each with its own quirks and safety things to consider.
Okay, well, let's jump into that world. What
Yeah.
kind of different scaffold types are we talking about here?
OSHA gives us a helpful rundown in Appendix A of 1926, Subpart L. Let's start with a familiar one, pole scaffolds, both the single and independent pole types. That's Appendix A 2A if you want to look it up.
Right, those are the ones you see a lot in construction and maintenance, right? They seem pretty straightforward to put together and take apart.
Yeah, they are. Relatively simple, but they still come with their own set of safety rules.
Of course. So even a basic pole scaffold, you got to make sure it's properly braced, secured, and inspected regularly, right?
Absolutely. Can't skip those steps. Safety first, always.
Okay, what about those tube and coupler scaffolds? Those are the ones that look a bit more, I don't know, industrial with all those tubes and clamps. Are those more versatile than pole scaffolds?
You got it. Tube and coupler scaffolds, those are in App A2B. You can customize them more because you can connect those tubes in all sorts of ways to create different shapes and sizes. More versatile, for sure.
That sounds handy. But with all that flexibility, I'm guessing it also gets more complicated to build them safely.
Right, more versatility, more complexity. And that means there are more chances for things to go wrong if they aren't assembled just right.
So with tube and coupler scaffolds, you really need someone who knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. Experience and training are key.
Okay, got it. What other types of scaffolds are out there?
Well, there are fabricated frame scaffolds mentioned in App A2C. These are kind of like pre-built units designed for quick and easy assembly.
Those are the ones that look like giant erector sets, right?
Exactly. I could see why they're so popular for jobs where you need things to go fast.
Yeah, speed and efficiency. But even though they're pre-built, you still got to follow OSHA's rules for putting them together, bracing them, and fall protection, right?
Absolutely. Just because it comes in a kit doesn't mean it's inherently safe. You can't get complacent.
Right. Safety is about more than just the type of equipment. It's about how you use it. Okay, so far we've got pole scaffolds, tube and coupler scaffolds, and fabricated frame scaffolds. Any other interesting types we should know about?
Well, OSHA also lists a bunch of more specialized scaffolds, each designed for a particular task. Like, there are bricklayer square scaffolds. Those are mentioned in Appendix A2E.
Bricklayer square scaffolds, what makes them unique?
Well, they have a square shape that's perfect for, you guessed it, bricklaying.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, what about those scaffolds you see window washers using? The ones that hang from the side of buildings?
Those are called window jack scaffolds, and they're described in App A2. They're designed to be suspended from a window opening, giving those window washers a stable platform to work from.
Wow, talk about a job with a view. I bet those require some serious trust in the anchoring system.
For sure. Those anchors gotta be bomb-proof. And speaking of specialized scaffolds, there are also roof bracket scaffolds. Those are mentioned in App A2H, and they're used for roofing work.
Roof bracket scaffolds, got it. How do those work?
Well, they're supported by brackets that attach to the roof structure, giving workers safe access to the roof.
So many different types. It's
Yeah.
pretty cool how much thought and engineering has gone into designing scaffolds for all these purposes.
Yeah, it really is. And it's important to remember that any scaffold that goes above those height limits we talked about earlier, it's got to be designed by a qualified person. That's stated clearly in 1926.451A6. Safety always starts with a solid plan, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say we've got our scaffold designed and built. We're ready to send people up there. But before we do, we got to talk about the people who actually put these things together and take them apart, the scaffold erectors. They're the ones who really need to know this stuff, inside and out, right?
They're on the front lines of scaffold safety for sure, and OSHA knows that. That's why they have very specific requirements when it comes to training for anyone involved in erecting or dismantling scaffold.
Now that's where things get interesting. Let's dive into the world of training for scaffold erectors, because I have a feeling it's a lot more than just learn how to use a wrench.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just about knowing your way around a wrench. It's about understanding the nuances of scaffold safety, like from the ground up.
Okay, so where does that understanding even begin? What's the starting point according to OSHA? What do they say about training these scaffold erectors?
OSHA, they lay out all those training requirements in Appendix D of 1926 Subpart L. It's a pretty in-depth guide, covers everything from like general scaffolding knowledge to training for specific types of scaffolds.
Wow, so they really do cover everything.
They really do. It's not just about, slapping a scaffold together. It's about understanding why you're doing each step and how it all contributes to keeping things safe.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's break it down a bit. What are some of the key topics in this general overview of scaffolding?
Well, it all starts with knowing the rules, right? Erectors, they got to be familiar with all the OSHA regulations and standards that apply to scaffold safety, like 1926 Subpart L. And they got to be aware of any local or state regulations, too.
Right, because I didn't know the rules isn't going to fly when it comes to safety.
Nope, not at all. And beyond just knowing the rules, erectors need to know how to actually apply them in the real world. That's where the planning comes in, the erection and dismantling planning.
Oh, that sounds crucial. It's got to be a lot more than just, like, throwing some pieces together and hoping for the best.
It's more like a carefully planned out dance, Every step has to be done just right to keep the structure stable and safe. They got to think about things like load capacities, the order you put things together and take them apart, using bracing and securing things properly. It's a lot to juggle.
That's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see why training is so important. It's not just about knowing how to build, it's about knowing how to build safely.
Exactly. And that understanding, it extends beyond just the scaffold itself. You got to think about the personal protective equipment too, the PPE.
Oh, right. PPE is like the safety uniform for anyone working at heights.
Exactly. Training needs to cover how to choose the right PPE, inspect it, and use it properly. We're talking everything from hard hats and safety glasses to gloves. And of course, you can't forget fall protection equipment.
Speaking of fall protection, that's got to be a huge focus of the training, right?
Huge focus. Appendix D, it really hammers home the importance of understanding those fall hazards. They go into detail on the different types of fall protection systems and how to use and inspect them properly. It's all about that trust but verify approach.
So it's not enough to just know how to put on a harness. You need to know how to make sure it fits right, check it for wear and tear, and use it correctly in different situations.
Right. It's about developing that safety mindset. You got to constantly be looking out for potential risks and taking steps to, head them off before they become problems.
Okay, we've got the regulations, the planning, the PPE, the fall protection. What else is covered in this general scaffolding overview?
Well, there's also materials handling. Scaffold erectors are often dealing with heavy and awkward stuff, so they need to know how to lift and carry it safely. Secure it properly. We're talking about preventing back injuries, crushed fingers, all sorts of hazards that come with moving big, heavy things around.
It's easy to forget about those more everyday tasks when you're thinking about scaffold safety. But they can be just as dangerous if you're not careful.
For sure. And finally, the general overview also touches on access and working platforms.
Access and working platforms. What exactly does that involve?
It's about knowing how to get on and off a scaffold safely, using ladders, stair towers, or other approved methods. And once you're up on that platform, it's about distributing the load properly, keeping your work area organized, preventing trip hazards, the whole 9 yards.
So it's all about creating that culture of safety, right? where everyone is aware of the potential dangers and actively working to avoid them, both on the ground and up on the scaffold.
Exactly. Safety first. It's got to be a habit, almost second nature to everyone on the job site.
Okay, so we've covered this sort of general foundation of scaffolding knowledge,
Yeah.
but you mentioned earlier that there's also type-specific training,
Yeah.
right? Like different scaffolds require different skills.
You got it. It's like getting your scaffolding driver's
I
license.
like that analogy.
A tube and clank scaffold is totally different from a tubular welded frame scaffold, for example. They have different ways of putting them together, different bracing techniques, different safety things you got to watch out for.
So let's dive into those different scaffold types and see what OSHA says about the training for each one. Where should we start?
Let's start with those tubular welded frame scaffolds. You know, those prefabricated systems that are so popular because they're relatively easy to put together.
The ones that look kind of like giant Lego sets?
That's the one. Appendix D lays out a bunch of key areas of training for these types of scaffolds. The first thing is you got to know the specific regulations and standards that apply to these things. It's like before you start playing a game, you got to know the rules, right? And in this case, those rules are there to save lives.
No one wants to learn about safety the hard way. So you got to know the rules.
Mm.
What comes after that?
Well, next, you got to understand all the different parts of a tubular welded frame scaffold. You know how all the frames, braces, platforms, and everything else fit together, what their weight limits are, and what their limitations are.
So it's like studying a detailed map of your scaffolding terrain before you even set foot on it.
Exactly. And just like you check a map for tiers or missing pieces, training also emphasizes the importance of inspecting all the parts. Before you even start putting a tubular welded frame scaffold together, you got to know how to spot things like defects, damage, or wear and tear, anything that could weaken the structure.
Right, because a weak link in the chain can bring the whole thing down. So we've got the regulations, the components, the inspection process. What's next?
Just like with any scaffolding project, planning is super important. That erection and dismantling planning, gotta get it right. It involves understanding the steps of putting it together and taking it apart, how to use bracing and securing mechanisms properly, and making sure it stays stable throughout the process.
It's almost like a giant puzzle where you got to put all the pieces in the right order. No forcing things if they don't fit.
Love that analogy. And of course, you can't forget about fall protection. It's critical during both erection and dismantling. The training covers specific fall hazards that you might encounter with this type of scaffold, the right fall protection systems to use, and how to anchor and use those systems correctly.
It's like you're creating a safe work zone, even while the scaffold itself is still being built or taken apart.
You got it. Safety never takes a break. And OSHA doesn't stop there. Appendix D, it really stresses the importance of general safety practices for tubular welded frame scaffolds. Things like keeping the work area clean and organized, not overloading the scaffold and paying attention to the weather. You know, things like wind or rain. It's about thinking beyond just the scaffold itself and looking at the whole work environment.
It's about fostering that culture of safety, where everyone is looking out for themselves and for each other and doing what they can to prevent accidents.
Exactly. It's all connected, right? Okay, now let's talk about those tube and clamp scaffolds. Those are the ones that look a bit more industrial with all those tubes and clamps.
Yeah, those are the ones that seem like they could be configured in a million different ways.
Exactly. And that's what makes them both versatile and a bit more tricky. The training for these guys, it's outlined in Appendix D, and it's structured kind of like the frame scaffold training, but with some extra layers of complexity. It all starts, of course, with knowing those regulations and standards.
So, again, it's all about knowing the specific rules of the game for this type of scaffold. And I'm guessing knowing the components becomes even more important with tube and clamp systems.
Mhm.
There are just so many parts and ways they can be put together.
You nailed it. Training really emphasizes being able to identify all the different tube sizes, clamp types, and other bits and pieces. It's not just about knowing what they're called, it's about understanding their strengths, their limitations, and how they work together to create a stable structure.
It's like you almost have to be a scaffolding engineer to work with these things. You need to be able to see the final structure in your head and know how each piece fits into the puzzle.
And that visualization, that's a key part of planning how to put together and take apart a tube and clamp scaffold. Because there are so many options, you can't just wing it. You got to have a clear plan before you even start grabbing those tubes and clamps.
So no winging it with these scaffolds. Careful planning, step-by-step assembly, constant attention to stability. That's the name of the game.
You got it. And just like with the frame scaffolds, fall protection is absolutely essential. Whether you're building it or taking it apart, you got to be protected. The training covers those specific fall hazards associated with tube and clamp systems and how to properly use and inspect your fall protection gear in those situations. Remember, things are changing all the time as you build and dismantle these things.
So again, it's about creating a safe work zone, even when the scaffold is in a state of flux.
Exactly. Safety is a constant. And those general safety practices, like keeping your work area clean and organized, not overloading the scaffold, and keeping an eye on the weather conditions, all of that applies to tube and clamp scaffolds, just like any other type.
It's about creating that culture of safety that we've been talking about, where everyone is looking out for each other and actively trying to prevent accidents.
Right on. And with tube and clamp scaffolds, that culture of safety, it also means understanding the unique challenges these systems present. The training, it really gets into things like proper bracing techniques, using locking mechanisms correctly, and the importance of keeping everything plumb, level, and square as you're building and taking it apart.
So it's not just about knowing the basics. It's about mastering the art of building a tube and clamp scaffold safely and correctly. It's those little tricks of the trade, those subtle things that experienced scaffold directors know how to do.
And that's where experience really shines through. You can learn a lot from a book, but nothing beats hands-on training with someone who's been there and done that. It's like learning to ride a bike. Reading about it only gets you so far. You got to actually hop on and start pedaling.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And just like with riding a bike, there are going to be some wobbles and near falls along the way.
Yeah.
That's why having a good teacher there to guide you and help you correct those mistakes is so important.
And for tube and clamp scaffolds, that expert guidance, it's especially crucial when you're dealing with more complicated setups, things like buttresses, cantilevers, and bridges. These are the next level of scaffolding, and they require a deeper understanding of load distribution, bracing, and all those safety considerations.
You're like taking your scaffolding skills to the next level, building structures that need that extra precision and attention to detail.
Exactly. And speaking of next level scaffolds, there are also system scaffolds. These are becoming more and more popular because they're so versatile and you can put them together so quickly. But just like with any other type, they require specialized training to make sure they're built and taken apart safely.
System scaffolds. Are those the ones that are kind of like pre-engineered kits where all the parts fit together in a very specific way?
You got it. They're like the fancy cousins of those frame scaffolds we talked about earlier. More versatile, quicker to assemble, but you still got to know what you're doing. They come with their own set of training requirements to make sure everything is done safely.
So it's back to the basics then, right?
Yeah.
Knowing the regulations and standards that apply to this specific type of scaffold, and I'm guessing understanding those components is even more important with system scaffolds because they're pre-engineered.
Absolutely. Training for these systems really focuses on being able to identify each part, what it does, and how much weight it can handle. It's like learning a whole new language where each component has its own name and its own role to play in the bigger picture.
So it's about learning the vocabulary of system scaffolds, being able to talk the talk with other erectors on the job site.
And just like with any language, you got to practice. That's why hands-on training is so essential for system scaffolds. It gives those erectors a chance to get up close and personal with the components, see how the assembly process works, and really get a feel for those safety procedures.
It's about building that scaffolding literacy, understanding not just the words, but how to use them in the real world.
Exactly. And that real world context, it's super important when it comes to planning for system scaffolds. Because these systems are often used for more complex structures, you got to have a super detailed plan, a plan that outlines every step of the assembly process, the bracing requirements, the fall protection measures, everything.
So it's like having a blueprint for your scaffolding project,
Mm-hmm.
a roadmap that guides you through each stage of the process and makes sure safety is built into the structure from the very beginning.
That's a great way to put it. Speaking of building things from the ground up, let's zero in on those fall protection training topics for system scaffolds.
Right, because no matter how pre-engineered or sophisticated a scaffold is, there's always a risk of falling, isn't there?
Always a risk. Gravity never takes a break. That's why the training really hammers home the importance of knowing those fall hazards that are specific to system scaffolds. You got to understand the right fall protection systems to use, how to anchor them properly, and how to inspect them to make sure everything is in good working order.
So it's about taking those general fall protection principles we've been talking about and adapting them to the unique quirks of these system scaffolds.
Precisely. And that adaptation process, that's something that needs to be emphasized during training. It's not enough to just know how to use a harness and a lanyard. You got to know how to apply those systems correctly in the context of a system scaffold.
So it's about bridging that gap between theory and practice, Taking that knowledge from the classroom and making sure it translates into real-world skills on the job site.
Exactly. And that's where hands-on training under the watchful eye of an experienced scaffold director really makes a difference. It's learning by doing, getting a feel for how the system works, and developing those muscle memory reflexes that can actually help you avoid a fall.
It's almost like learning a martial art, isn't it?
Yeah.
You start with the basic moves, but then you practice them over and over again until they become second nature. And then, if you ever need to react quickly in a dangerous situation, those ingrained reflexes can be the difference between staying safe and getting hurt.
Great analogy. It really highlights how important it is to not just know the rules, but to be able to apply them instinctively in a real-world setting.
Okay, so we've covered fall protection. What other specific training topics do they emphasize for system scaffolds?
Appendix D, it emphasizes those general safety practices we've talked about before, just like with any other type of scaffold. Keeping the work area clean, making sure things are organized, not overloading the scaffold, and watching out for weather hazards like wind and rain. It's about creating that safety-first mindset that goes beyond the scaffold itself and encompasses the entire work environment.
It's about creating a culture where safety is woven into the fabric of everything you do on the job site.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with system scaffolds, that safety culture, it also means understanding the unique characteristics of these systems. The training, it really drills down on proper bracing techniques, using those locking mechanisms correctly, and making sure everything is plumb, level, and square throughout the process of putting the scaffold up and taking it down.
Right, so even though these systems are pre-engineered, there's still plenty of room for human error. It's about having those checks and balances in place to catch those errors before they turn into accidents.
Exactly. And don't forget about access and platforms. Training needs to cover how to use ladders, stair towers, and other ways to get onto the scaffold safely. It also covers those best practices for working on the platform, including things like how to distribute the load, keep things organized, and prevent trip hazards.
So even though these systems are designed for speed and efficiency, you still got to take those extra steps to make sure every part of the work process is safe and well thought out.
That's right. It's about creating a work environment where efficiency and safety go hand in hand. You don't have to sacrifice one for the other. And when you combine that with thorough training and a commitment to following those safety rules, you can really minimize those risks and keep everyone on the job site safe.
This deep dive into training for scaffold directors has been eye-opening. It's obvious that OSHA takes this stuff seriously. They want to make sure that anyone working at those heights has the knowledge and skills to stay safe.
And speaking of staying safe, let's shift gears and zoom in on the most crucial element of scaffold safety: fall protection.
Okay, fall protection. We've touched on it a bit throughout our discussion on training, but I'm really interested to hear more about those specific requirements. What are some of the biggest takeaways from OSHA's regulations on this?
You're spot on. We've talked about it generally, but now let's get specific. And like you said, OSHA is serious about preventing those falls from scaffolds.
Okay, so what's that big rule, the one we always hear about with fall protection on scaffolds?
10 feet. That's the magic number. According to 1926.451 a year, if you're working 10 feet or more above a lower level, you got to have fall protection. No ifs, ands, or buts.
10 feet. You know, I thought it would have been higher. That really drives home the point that falls can happen from what seem like pretty low heights.
Exactly. Even a short fall from a scaffold can be really bad news. And it's interesting how OSHA changes the fall protection rules based on the type of scaffold, right? Like we've been talking about.
Right. Certain types, they need both a personal fall arrest system and a guardrail system. It's like OSHA saying, hey, for these setups, we're not messing around. You need multiple layers of protection.
Exactly. For example, think about those single-point and two-point adjustable suspension scaffolds. Those are mentioned in 1926.451G12. Those are the ones that are like hanging in midair, so you absolutely need both a personal fall arrest system and a guardrail system to keep people from falling.
Okay, yeah. Makes sense. It's like you're literally just hanging there, so better safe than sorry.
Right. And then you've got some scaffolds like those boatswain's chairs, catenary scaffolds, float scaffolds, needle beam scaffolds, and ladder jack scaffolds. All of those need personal fall arrest systems, according to 1926.451G. Those are the ones that are often used in very specific situations and might not be as structurally sound as some other types. So having that individual fall protection is really, really important.
Right, because there's not much room for error with those setups. Okay, so let's dive into personal fall arrest systems. A lot of people are familiar with harnesses and lanyards, but what are some of the things to keep in mind when using them on scaffolds?
The big thing to remember is that a personal fall arrest system, it's only as good as its anchor point. You got to be absolutely sure that your lanyard or lifeline is hooked up to something solid, something on the scaffold structure that won't budge.
I've heard some scary stories about people clipping their lanyards to things that just weren't meant to hold the weight of a falling person.
That's a recipe for disaster, and OSHA's got your back here. 1926.451G3 is super detailed about how those personal fall arrest systems should be attached. Like, there are rules about how to attach lanyards, lifelines, all of that. For example, you can't attach a vertical lifeline to a single or two-point adjustable suspension scaffold if it has overhead components, and you have to attach it to a fixed point. No attaching to standpipes, vents, or electrical conduit.
So no shortcuts when it comes to anchoring those lifelines. You got to have a strong foundation for your safety system.
You got it. And it's not just the anchor point. You also got to think about the lifeline itself and how it's set up. For instance, if you're using a horizontal lifeline, it needs to be hooked up to at least two structural members of the scaffold. And if the scaffold's got suspension and independent support lines, you can loop it around both of those. That's in 1926.451G3.
It seems like OSHA is big on redundancy when it comes to fall protection, like always having a backup in case something fails.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, two is one and one is none. When it comes to safety, having a backup plan can be a lifesaver. Literally. All right, so we've covered a personal fall arrest systems. Let's talk about guardrail systems. We touched on them a bit earlier, but can you explain how they work as a primary fall protection method?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned some height requirements before, but it can't just be about how tall they are, right?
Nope. You're right, those heights matter. Like how newer supported scaffolds need a top rail between 38 and 45 inches high, while older supported scaffolds and all those suspended scaffolds need a top rail between 36 and 45 inches high. That's from 1926.4512, by the way. But you're right, it's more than just about height. They also need to be super strong and stable.
Right. What good is a guardrail if it collapses when someone leans on it? That would kind of defeat the whole purpose.
Exactly, and that's where 1926.451 comes in. It spells out all those strength requirements. For instance, that top rail, it needs to be able to withstand a force of at least 200 pounds on most types of scaffolds. That's a lot of force. Shows you how important it is to use good materials and build them right.
And those guardrails have to be anchored properly to the scaffold, just like those lifelines. You can't be cutting corners there either.
Absolutely. And here's an interesting tidbit. 1926.451G 4X even says you can use some scaffold parts as end guardrails, things like hoists or stirrups, but only if they meet those same strength and spacing rules.
So you can get creative, but you still got to follow the rules. It's fascinating to see how all these elements come together to create a comprehensive fall protection plan. The personal fall arrest systems, the guardrails, all those rules about anchoring and strength. It's like a safety symphony. Each instrument playing its part to create this beautiful, harmonious whole.
I love that. It really is a symphony of safety. A good fall protection plan is more than just checking boxes on a list. It's about understanding how everything works together and how to tailor it to the specific challenges of each job site.
And it's about realizing that even the best plan in the world can't replace common sense and a commitment to safety from everyone involved. Training, communication, creating a work environment where safety is truly the #1 priority. It all matters.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into scaffold safety, I want to leave you with this. Remember what we talked about today. Building those scaffolds right, getting that thorough training, making sure you have solid fall protection. Those are the keys to keeping things safe. And remember, never, ever put speed or convenience ahead of safety. Your life and the lives of those around you are worth so much more than that.
So well said. If this deep dive has sparked your interest in scaffold safety, head over to OSHA's website. It's full of helpful information, and they're always updating it with the latest safety guidance. And of course, there are tons of other great resources out there too. Industry publications, training materials, those real-world case studies you sent me. Keep learning, keep exploring, because when it comes to working at heights, knowledge is your best friend.
Couldn't agree more.
So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe out there.